Hello and welcome to On the Line Perspectives on Partition with me, Paul McFadden. This is a series of programmes, conversations really, in which people from diverse backgrounds discuss the partition of the island of Ireland 100 years ago this year. The series has been organised by the Bloody Sunday Trust. Our guest for this programme is an academic, a sociologist, an historian and a southerner. He's coordinator of the LGBT Heritage Project and was a consultant to the Irish Government's Forum for Peace and Reconciliation. An impressive CV that. His name is Dr. Richard O'Leary. Richard, thanks for agreeing to talk to us as part of this series. We're delighted to have you on board in a sense. And if you don't mind, I'd like to begin just by talking about your latest commission by Outburst Arts, which is a pretty unusual thing. Explain to us just exactly what it is you're going to be doing in the very near future.
Yes, this being the centenary of the establishment of Northern Ireland, there's some money made available by the Northern Ireland Office, administered through the Heritage Fund, for projects to engage with that and to mark in some way. And Outburst Arts have applied and received some funding, which will enable me to write and perform on stage a solo piece which I've called My Queer History of Northern Ireland. And that will be a storytelling show which will take people through 100 years of the existence of Northern Ireland, but through, I suppose, the experience of being queer or LGBTQ. Me personally, I identify as a gay man, and my storytelling is largely autobiographical. Now, obviously, I haven't lived for 100 years, but I can engage with, with the past 100 years, I suppose, from the perspective of being LGBTQ, which is a different way of engaging with living on the island and living with partition. And you just have to wait till probably next November to experience it live. I do intend to come to Derry to perform it, and that will be hopefully an opportunity for people to just get a different perspective on partly on the theme that we're talking about tonight.
So is it about your personal experience of being in Northern Ireland, or is it sort of the wider experience of LGBTQ people in Northern Ireland?
Well, I've done a number of storytelling shows, and they're all about my experience, but in the context of whatever social situation I'm finding. So, for example, my first show was called There's a Bishop in My Bedroom, and it was about faith and sexuality. And I did a show 2 years ago called Stories for the Month of the Holy Souls, which was about that. So I draw on my own experience, and I'm age 56, so I have a lot of experience. But I can reach out to other events, which perhaps through personal connection or through a physical visit, I can also relate to. So I'd like to think that it's beyond the personal and something more general that audiences can relate to. And I should say that I have adopted storytelling as a form because I find that for some material, pretty controversial topics, there are things you can more easily say, or you can say in a way that audiences can relate to in a different way. And obviously my purposes are partly educational and empathy, and not just entertainment. So I felt some of the academic form doesn't lend itself to some of the things I want to say, and that the performance storytelling form does. And of course, being from Ireland, I feel I've inherited an oral storytelling tradition. In fact, even with my own family, I feel I come from an oral storytelling tradition. So it's not that big a leap for me to switch from academia to performance storytelling. and I try and do both. In fact, I'm have resumed, you know, some academic writing on LGBT history in parallel with performance storytelling. But as with all these things, you have to see it to understand it.
Yeah, yeah. But I'm guessing you don't set out to be controversial, you know, just for the sake of it. But I kind of imagine if you were to talk about your experience being a gay man, I think that you quite happily be able to do that nowadays in the Republic of Ireland. You could certainly quite happily be able to do that in Britain. In Northern Ireland, it might kind of, you know, it might cause eruptions in some quarters.
Yes, it does. I mean, it has got easier, but and I should say that when I moved north to live here in 1988, and you know, at that time, social attitudes in the south were as conservative as they were in the north. That is, negative, hostile. In fact, even though the north had decriminalized same-sex relationships with men in 1982, it was another 11 years, 1993, before the Republic did. So I only came out when I moved north as a student at Queen's. In fact, it was probably easier for me to move to the other end of the island and to come out to some people at college at Queen's, because I wasn't, you know, near my family. Whereas we had, you know, what was called a gay SOC, Student Society for LGBT at Queen's, and you know, very few local students were comfortable attending because they were terrified, because they were physically so close. So it is easier to open up and be open about who you are if you are physically removed, as I was by moving to the other end of the island. That said, especially in the 80s, it was particularly difficult because in the context of the emergence of AIDS and kind of a right-wing UK Thatcher government, you know, things were actually becoming more negative for us. But I've seen great changes, improvements in the last few decades, including in Northern Ireland, primarily attributable to the activism of LGBT people themselves and their straight allies, and usually in defiance of you know, government in Northern Ireland and particularly some political parties. But it was hard. And also my own situation, personal situation was more complicated because of, you know, falling in love with a local, and he was different religious background, and so it was complicated.
Yeah, put it mildly. It's funny, you know, that you wind up having spent so much of your life in Northern Ireland, because you were born and you grew up in County Cork, and you were as far away as anybody on this island could have been. You could have chosen to remain from this place and all the baggage that goes with it. But you've come here and you've stayed here, and you've made it your home. What were your sort of your first impressions of Northern Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, I should say that, and this is not a maybe typical experience for a Southerner, but obviously some Southerners would have this experience. I grew up in County Cork, yes, but I walked a mile and a half to a rural school. And just before I reached that school, aged 5, when I started, I passed a monument to 6 teenagers who had been members of the Old IRA in the War of Independence. Mm-hmm. And in 1920, they were caught in a farmhouse near the school, and they were killed. So that was called the Ballycannon murders. So even from primary school, I was aware of a history and a history including violence, and that was then, I suppose, added to by growing up in a household that had only single channel TV. And so my first TV images that I can remember were actually of rioting, which I was told was happening in the other part of the island. So even though I wasn't present in Northern Ireland, I did feel that I grew up with it at one remove.
Yeah. And
Uh,
may I just say at that point, Richard, that any right-thinking, normal family, given that situation, given the fact that you were in Cork and a lot of this stuff was happening in places like Derry, would keep a million miles away from it if they could.
yes,
That's
and
what happened in the old area.
that wasn't happened. I mean, I had an aunt who lived in Drogheda. We went up there every summer for summer holidays, and because that was near the north, because my own father, he was a member of Fianna Fáil, he would have been on the Republican wing of Fianna Fáil, so I would consider that I came from a nationalist family. You know, he took us up north in 1969 on holidays. In fact, I have a photograph here, which is of me, aged 5, on William Street in Derry, and we 4 kids, my siblings and I, are sitting on a barricade. I mean, there's no rioting or anything, but so I would have gone home and said, oh yeah, I was in holidays and we played, you know, with rubble, and there's pictures of me with soldiers. So so yes, I mean, it was unusual that my father, out of his own curiosity, I suppose, you know, took us in that situation. So
My father was born in William Street, by the way, Richard, just for, you know.
It's a small world.
It's a small world indeed.
But maybe it's not surprising that I studied history, you know, when I left school, and I decided during my time as an undergraduate, there's 2 things I want to do. I wanted to go live in a communist country, which I did after I graduated, and I wanted to go and spend some time living in Northern Ireland, which I did after I came back from China in 1988. I went to Queen's and I registered for a master's, and part of my motivation was a way of living in Northern Ireland and seeing what that experience would be like. Because I should say that for me, when I think of my country, I've always thought of the island. And that's natural to me. And I know there are other people who live in Northern Ireland, and when they think of their country, they did not think of the whole island. They think of Northern Ireland. But you know, that's who I was, and that's who I still am. So it didn't seem that unusual for me. But when I arrived at Queen's and started my course, I came out as gay, which was a big thing in my life. But what I wasn't expecting was, of course, that the first man that I met and fell in love with was a local man, and who was actually a Protestant from East Belfast. And that quickly colored my I suppose, perception and experience of Northern Ireland, because when I first arrived, I was socializing with some other students, and you know, I was living in university accommodation on Malone Road, and yes, I was conscious that there were, you know, there were army patrols, but I wasn't getting stopped by the RUC, and I wasn't particularly impacted, apart from knowing that it was you know, violent conflict happening around me, and having kind of some academic interest in it. But you know, within 6 months, I'd moved out of my house because of homophobic comments being made about me by one of the students in the house, and I actually moved in with my partner Mervyn, who at that time was living and working in the Shankill. So unusually, I found that coming from a Southern nationalist background, agnostic Catholic, I'm actually quickly immersed. I wasn't immersed, find myself living, because obviously I had to do it in a very discreet way, you know, with an Ulster Protestant in a loyalist area. And that completely changed my, I suppose, even feelings about Northern Ireland in a way which surprised me, and maybe is unusual, because I remember living with Mervyn in the Shankill, and there being, you know, which felt a bit like a ghetto physically, because it was kind of surrounded by nationalist Republican areas, and there'd been IRA and INLA attacks, and they were actually on the area that I was living in, and it affected how I felt about that, because there were people who I knew who were under attack or in danger, and I kind of saw what it might be from the other side. I mean, I previously had, viewed Unionist Protestants as being the other side, but living among them, I began to say, oh, so this is what it feels like. And I hear things that they were saying. Now, I never gave my surname. I passed myself off as a Southern Protestant. But all of a sudden I said, oh, so many of them, and these, are very ignorant about the South. They've never been there. There's variation of opinion, but some of them are very hostile, and quite offensive about the South. I found that this was a very different culture to my own, and therefore previous things that I would have heard, like, oh, sure, we're all Irish men, women, because we live on the one island, was simplistic, because I discovered there was such variation of belief, and you couldn't just dismiss it as, oh, these people have false consciousness because they just maybe haven't been to the South, or they've been duped by what they've been taught at school or not taught at school. I mean, I had to accept what these people believe instead at face value, because I was now meeting them at face value, meeting them in person.
Was the fact that you were a gay man, was that known?
No, that wasn't known because, well,
so your sexual orientation and your religion, you both had to keep both those factors.
The point is, because I mean, before I moved to Shankill, I was coming home one night wearing a leather jacket, and I was attacked on the Malone Road. So basically, I felt as much danger for being gay and open about it as I felt about my religion. So I mean, with religion, you weren't really in danger if people didn't know that you were in the wrong place. So you and also when you're young, you tend to be a bit more fearless. I mean, in hindsight, the way I lived, I think, was dangerous. I mean, I used to use a laundrette in Woodvale, which, if anything had happened to me, people would have said, well, what was he doing there? They would have assumed kind of negative motives. But yeah, there was definitely an issue of having to manage more than one identity, an identity as a gay man, an identity as, I would say, a Southerner, because that obviously stands out, and then as someone from with a very obviously Catholic Irish surname, and accent, which of course meant I had to be very quiet.
Yeah. I mean, there are a number of things I'd like to talk to you about, but the main point of this discussion, I'll come to that, and then there are a few other things I do want to pick up with you. But the whole point of this series of discussions, it's about partition 100 years ago this year, huge event in Irish and British and even European history. In your opinion, because you are an historian, you're a sociologist, you studied history, politics, and all of that. When you think back to that act 100 years ago, and when you look at everything that has happened since because of it, what are your impressions of the act of partition?
Well, I now can distinguish between my intellectual kind of response and my past engagement with it, and what life experience taught me. So when I, first became aware of it, maybe initially as a primary school student and secondary school student of history, I mean, I thought that this was wrong in various ways. It was wrong because I felt it was undemocratic, because I felt, there'd been a majority on the island that had, voted for nationalist parties. I felt it was wrong that Northern Ireland's boundaries were created to create a unionist majority, and then maybe later I thought it was wrong because I didn't think it was successful. It wasn't successful because it didn't put an end to conflict so, you know, I would have, you know, would say an intellectual and kind of, you know, personal experience, you know, being very negative about partition for those reasons. Now, what happened through life experience was I have lived a cross-border life. I've lived cross-border life insofar as, you know, I primarily stayed, though I did spend some time in England for working for the study, because I, you know, fell in love with a northerner who was very much a northerner, and I knew wouldn't really be happy if we moved south or to England, even though that would have been an easier thing, you know, as a gay couple. But living in Northern Ireland has proved, you know, problematic for me as a gay man in various ways, because, for example, it was a homophobic society, and I thought, you know, we actually moved just south of the border for a number of years, thinking it would be a little bit easier to move out of Northern Ireland with, you know, with violence and arguably a bit more homophobic. And then we found at various times, for example, that we had both pension and social security contributions, both north and south. And even though this had once been, you know, one state, you know, the whole island with Britain, now the, you know, pension schemes have diverged. And I actually remember raising this at a meeting of the Irish Association about a dozen years ago, saying, you know, I have two pensions, one Northern Ireland, UK, and one Republic of Ireland, and they both actually derive from the original UK civil service pension scheme. So they're basically the same pension. And how come I can't combine them? Because that would make sense to my life. And I don't think people even realized what an important question that was for individual, because they're not affected. Or I find that, you know, when I first came up, I could use a first-class stamp to post to Cork, and now I have to go to post office because you can't buy it in a shop, get in European, or this under recently, an e-stamp, which costs me a fortune. So it costs me like multiple times to post a letter to Dublin than it does to London, and that makes no sense to me. Or with phones, how it's easier if you're in the south to get a phone with tariff that really covers the whole island, but if you're in the north with UK focused companies, I've often ended up with two, you know, with two phones, and this is not an easy way to live. And our bank, you know, I have a Bank of Ireland account in the Republic in Northern Ireland. They're the same name, but they refuse to recognise that some of us would actually just like to have one card that we can put into a machine. And so I found at a personal level there have been tremendous barriers to just an ease of living. So that makes me very negative about partition, because I don't think partition is making my life easy. And that's why I've personally really embraced anything that makes it easier to live a life smoothly. And I don't just mean a north-south life, I also wanted an easy east-west life. Because when the Good Friday Agreement came in, I really related to it, because I was a person who, I live a life which is in Northern Ireland, which is cross-community. In fact, you know, I'm probably have an unusual high degree of kind of, you know, cross-community living with Northern Ireland, but I have a north-south life and have an east-west life. And the Good Friday Agreement seemed to encapsulate that. Plus, it said that if we're to have any change, it has to be on a kind of electoral basis and not by violence. And that sounds to me perfect, because life experience has also taught me that the price that we paid for violent conflict was enormous, but most people in Northern Ireland, I think because they were socialized into it, didn't realize how high priced it was. But becoming from a peaceful place, I said, my God, people are paying such a high price here for violence. So, and then maybe that's the advantage of being not local, that you can really see, you know, I mean, I do think it was very bad, and therefore that colors my view as to what our response would be in the future. So yes, I felt partition has been a very negative thing, but I've also feel that the way to proceed from that, to me, is very much encapsulating in the Good Friday Agreement. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't aspects of it I don't like vetoes and declaring community affiliation, but those principles, you know, of the 3 dimensions plus any change beyond democratic basis makes so much sense to me that I will actually, you know, argue for them and go public to talk about them because I believe in them.
I'm thinking at this point, as we talk, I mean, about your partner Mervyn, who strikes me must have been a remarkable man, you know. And you mentioned before we began our discussion a phrase you used to use, generous majority.
Yeah.
Tell us a wee bit about that. Tell us a wee bit about Mervyn, and then a wee bit about that phrase.
Well, I suppose, I mean, we obviously got on for personal reasons, but in addition to that, his name is Mervyn Kingston, and Kingston is a Cork name, and I immediately recognized that because, you know, my own name is very Cork, and I was very subconscious about it. And the reason that he had a Cork name was because his father was a Southern Irish Protestant from Bandon, who in the 1920s moved north, as did his brother, and they did so, I mean, primarily because as Southern Unionist Protestant, they no longer wanted to live in the Irish Free State. Now, there would have been additional incentive for economic reasons, but I didn't meet his father because he died, but, you know, Mervyn told me about his father, and his father was bitter, and his father only went back to Cork once. And I think that the degree to which, you know, the partition caused that disruption has been maybe underestimated. And then I actually done some separate study on you know, what happened the Southern Irish Protestant Unionist minority, but I thought, you know, I mean, it didn't, you know, it didn't seem like a good outcome that someone, and his family had been in Cork for generations, right? I mean, going back to the Williamite period, and I think, and I know what it's like to you know, to leave, you know, a place that you love, and I think, my God, that must have been tough, and yet he was bitter about the people he left behind, and I think so. But to relate to generous majorities, Mervyn maybe was shaped by that, but it was something we agreed on. And I'll give you a few examples of what it means. First is, at the time of partition, Northern Ireland was created to have a unionist majority, and they got the big prize. The people there who were unionists got to remain within the United Kingdom. So they should have been generous. They should have, you know, they should have been generous in terms of you know, giving more to the minority than the minority could claim on numbers alone, you know.
Edward Kirsten said that himself, actually, you know. Edward Kirsten said exactly that.
You know, and that would have included in terms of electoral representation, and it would include in terms of recognition of the Irish language and Irish identity. And they didn't do that. I think that was a political mistake, but I also think it was morally wrong. It was the same in the Irish Free State Republic of Ireland. The Catholic Church was the overwhelming faith of the people, and yet they abused that by, for example, in their teaching on mixed marriage. They knew that Protestant minority were under threat, you know, and they said, you marry a Catholic, you got to convert, and you got to bring the kids up as Catholic. And even in, you know, when I first met Mervyn, they'd watered it down, you know, you didn't have to give it in writing, and it wasn't really a promise, it was just to try as hard as you could. And Mervyn saw it for what it was. It was the Catholic Church in the South throwing its weight around, putting pressure on the minority denomination to conform. That wasn't generous. And I can see the same in relation to to sexuality, you know. I mean, to extend civil marriage to, you know, the minority who are gay and lesbian wasn't going to detract anything from the experience of the straight majority. But no, you can do it if majorities are generous. And remember, if you're a majority, you're coming from a position of strength. I think it's a morally good thing to do. I also think it's a politically good thing to do, because you will head off grievance and opposition. And I think that that's very indicative of the situation that we have in Northern Ireland. I think if unionists, when they were a majority, were more generous, they would have headed off much of the necessary response to position at the minority forest. So if we learn a lesson like that, that would be a good one to bring forward to the future, because my concern about you know, talk about, you know, border poll, and that is, have we already learned to be generous to our minorities when we're the majority? So for example, in my local council area, which is very much unionist dominated, you know, I don't see them reaching out to disproportionately fund or to acknowledge minorities. You know, I mean, Irish language would be a good example, or our identity, or the same when there's a nationalist Republican majority in a council, either being disrespectful to the minority, or taking advantage of it to behave in a way which makes it very uncomfortable for the minority. In that regard, I have to say, I thought I've been quite impressed by things I've seen happening in Derry. The way, for example, you've managed in recent years apprentice boy parades, in terms of saying, we know this is very important to the minority. It's done in a way that really doesn't, you know, bother us too much anymore. So let's come up with good practice like that. And I'd like to see a lot more of that good behavior by majorities, including at local council level, before I feel we're ready to move on about how we deal with bigger changes, which, for example, like, you know, politically redrawing boundaries.
See, Richard, as a Derry man, I mean, I think we also have to acknowledge the, you know, the role of some of the unionist politicians in a majority nationalist Republican city. They played a very constructive role in that, and groups like the Londonderry Bands Forum and the Apprentice Boys and stuff like that. But I understand where you're coming from. Look, Rich, we'll leave it there for now. The whole point of the series is that we have people giving their thoughts, their perspectives on the border, on partition, on the line, you know, in that sense. And your experience is very different to any that we've heard in the series up to now. And I'm going to tell you this, that phrase of Mervyn's and yours, generous majority, it's one that I'm going to take from this entire series of conversations. And I'll just keep that in the back of my head, because I think if we do kind of all bear that in mind, I think we could, it would certainly maybe change the way we behave, it would certainly change the way we relate to one another, and it could certainly improve not just this place, the Northern Ireland, but the whole island, and it could do so much for relations within these islands as well. So thank you for joining us on the programme. Thank you for being so candid, so entertaining at times as well, and thanks a million for going on the line on Partition.
Thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts, and good luck with the rest of the project.